What did you make of everything you saw, Jemele, yesterday? Because, like I'm saying, even as I watch this growth and I talk about some of the things that we've talked about, which is like that regular season college basketball ratings are better than regular season NBA ratings. Caitlin Clark is at the front of a movement that I never expected to see flourish in a place like Iowa.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just really incredible to watch all these new fans coming to the game. The fact that Caitlin has created her own economy. And this is the moment, I think, in women's sports. But let's just say women's basketball, because we've seen, obviously, with women's soccer, we've seen some other very important seminal moments in other women's sports. But for women's basketball, this really feels like their time. I mean, it's been an escalating movement. Ratings the last 5 years have been really incredible, both at the college level and at the WNBA level. And now there is somebody else, maybe a bigger phenomenon than we've seen maybe in maybe 15 or 20 years, somebody that is going to transition to the WNBA and bring, hopefully, all of this enthusiasm, these fans, all of this with her. It felt, I said this last year when Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark obviously squared off in the women's Final Four, is that this very much feels like this could potentially be the Larry Bird, Magic Johnson kind of moment, if you will, in the sense of that something that was so special at the college level transferred over to the professional level, and it changed the NBA forever.
Have you given any thought as all of the streaming services fight for sports content and these are undervalued rights properties, what this is going to end up going for when this stuff sells for what it's worth?
Yeah, it's grossly. It's a huge bargain right now. I think women's sports, especially women's basketball, if you think about it. And all I ask people to do as they're constantly ramming the women's game up against where the men's game is in its current form is to look at the same measure of time of when women's or when men's sports started to take off, like how long that took. It usually took, 2, 3, sometimes 4 decades for it to really solidify and come together. And I think this is what you're starting to see the evolution of now, all the hard work, the fact that a lot of these women had been in this game and been committed to this game when there wasn't the type of payoff that you're seeing Caitlin Clark have now. There was something, even though this was a great moment, Dan, I have to be honest, there was one small bit of it that was sad. And this is where the conversation takes a turn. I saw something that Lynette Woodard said. Now, Lynette Woodard, one of the greatest players in women's history. And when she played in college, it was still under the AIAW, which was the governing body for women's sports before the NCAA began to include women's sports. So quick history lesson, everybody. Not until the early 80s did the NCAA actually include women's sports. So they had their own separate governing body, of which Lynette Woodard had the record for a large school, the scoring record for a large school. And she said that if it wasn't for Caitlin Clark, people wouldn't remember her. And that made me really sad. And because the unfortunate downside, if you want to call it that, to Caitlin Clark's success, she's so great. She deserves all this attention. The Nike ad was phenomenal. But it also makes you understand the erasure that has happened in this game. And Lynette Woodard, again, I said she holds the large school scoring record. Pearl Moore actually holds the lower school scoring record for the AIAW, which was 4,061 points. None of these scoring records are included with the NCAA. And that's the shame of it, is that they didn't transfer over the scoring records. And I'm not saying that that diminishes in any way what kind of player and what kind of performer and what kind of talent that Caitlin Clark is. But when people are talking about who she's doing this on the shoulders of, a lot of it is Black women whose, frankly, legacies have been erased. And so I hope this is an opportunity, a teachable opportunity for people to understand the people that came before them. And so when you hear someone, I know she got into a lot of trouble, but when you hear Cheryl Swoops talking about and trying to contextualize what Caitlin Clark has done, she's probably thinking not only about herself, but all these other women who have come before her that have had their legacies pushed aside and erased, because that's just in many ways how sports fans are programmed to do when it comes to women's sports. So I hope this is a good opportunity for people to learn more about the great players that have preceded this moment.
I don't know if that, like, I hope the same thing, but I don't know if that's happening at all because I think the coverage of women's college basketball this season has completely ignored the fact that South Carolina just had their second back-to-back undefeated season. They haven't lost at home in like 3 or 4 years, and they're the best team in the country right now, ranked number 1, undefeated, 27-0. Haven't lost an SEC regular game in years. And like, I feel like they're getting no national attention. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that we, as a entire like sports media industry, don't cover women's sports very well to begin with. And also the jobs keep shrinking more and more too. But I'm wondering, Jemele, how you feel about that and the fact that like, it feels like, yes, we're talking about women's basketball more, but it's mostly just Caitlin Clark in Iowa.
Well, if you recall, and I'm so glad that you brought that up. If you recall, a couple years ago, Paige Beckers, the obviously outstanding player for UConn, she gave her SB speech because I think she was awarded Female Athlete of the Year. During her speech, she made a point to recognize the fact that the entire sport, and even the sport in the moment of where it was in that particular time, was a sport that was built off the contributions and the effort and the commitment of Black women. That's not to diminish what white women have done. I have had these conversations with Black women who have played basketball, who currently play basketball, and with some who coach basketball, and they don't begrudge. And I don't want to collectively speak for all of them, but one thing that we have certainly talked about in the last few years is how there are certain machines that get behind certain players and not others. Like, you wouldn't know, looking in many ways at women's basketball, to know that A'ja Wilson is probably the best player in the world. And you probably wouldn't know that. And you look at her success, you can now add a New York Times bestselling author to it. But these machines, I have to be honest, a lot of times, not saying it's strictly the time, a lot of times they do follow, white players. And there is this worry and this concern that a lot of the phenomenon is being built specifically around certain faces for certain reasons. And so that's why Paige Beckers, her speech a couple years ago, was very meaningful, and it meant a lot to a lot of the players who are playing in the game who see this kind of happen. And I get it with Caitlin Clark. I mean, living in Iowa, playing for a university that traditionally has not had some of the other success. It's an underdog story. It's a middle America story. And she is playing the game in a way we have never seen a woman play the game that represents where we are in the modern form of basketball. She's Steph Curry in so many ways. And while there is this phenomenon there and swirling and bubbling and creating this tornado of events, I think it is I don't think it diminishes or takes away from her success at all to say, wait a minute, how did we get here? And what does this really mean? Not just for Caitlin Clark, but for all players.
When you mention the history, though, you mentioned Magic and Larry's whiteness helped all of that become what it was. Like, those games were on tape delay before, finals games were on tape delay before we had a white guy and a black guy fighting for stardom, right? Because what Jessica's mentioning is true, but it's so much, in that sport, we gravitate toward the stars more than the teams.
Yeah, I mean, and you're right, Dan. I mean, that was part of what it was. It's like you had white guy from Indiana against a black guy from Michigan. And even though Lansing is the capital of Michigan, but it is a smallish town, maybe not as small as where Larry Bird grew up. But the reality is that those optics were helpful in growing the game. And even though there was that undercurrent of race that was forever there, it did help grow it. And we saw how strong that undercurrent of race was between Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese. And frankly, even with Cheryl Swoops, and don't get me wrong, I understand that there was factually some things that Cheryl Swoops got wrong in characterizing her game. And later on, those things were corrected in that same podcast. But, Cheryl Swoops talked about the fact that she was called a racist for critically analyzing her game. And if anybody could analyze her game, you would think Cheryl Swoops would be qualified. So that bubbling, that undercurrent is there. Because even when I bring up Caitlin Clark, it's like, and we've seen this so much in sports before, Dan and Stu, is that if you don't call them the greatest thing you've ever seen, if you don't say, hey, this is the most exciting women's player ever, this is the best women's player ever, that you're somehow being a hater. And if you're black and saying it, somehow you're being a racist toward Caitlin Clark. And it's like, no, I've just watched 30 plus years of women's basketball. And I will say she's one of the best college players in history. She is definitely the most exciting women's player in the game right now. But the extra platitudes turns this conversation into something it's not supposed to be. We're supposed to all feel like Lucy right now, but there's always these other things. And, unfortunately, when you become a grizzled veteran, you can't unsee some of these things.
It's true. It's like you want, I think the Caitlin Clark conversation should happen, but also it would be great if the rest of the sport got some coverage, at least like a little bit. I feel like this season has been so focused on it, which then, like you said, it adds to this feeling of like, you don't want to take anything away from it, but you wish there was just more. Like, I wish there was just more of it nationally.
And you could tell in the analysis too. And that's another part where it's clear that there needs to be some growth in this game, is that you're having a lot of people chime in who have not watched beyond maybe Caitlin Clark in Iowa, beyond maybe the last couple of years. And so you also see sort of this vast hole in terms of who is talking about women's sports. Certainly there's a lot of incredible female analysts, but Caitlin Clark, her success hasn't gotten a lot of them positioned to talk about Caitlin Clark, even though they've been talking about women's basketball for a long time. People are by default looking at the men to contextualize what is happening. I mean, God bless Shaq. I know, when he said that she was the best women's player in history, and I'm like, dude, Cheryl Miller's still here, right? Like, I'm not saying that those conversations shouldn't be had, but that's what's happening, is that people are going to Shaq. They're going to, men who certainly watch the game, but the women's game, while all still basketball, it's a different game. And I think we need more people to be able to analyze this game properly, who are women who have been doing this for a long time.
That was your friendly neighborhood race lady.
Was there any moment for you cooler yesterday than the way Caitlin Clark squealed when she saw the Pioneer? She saw Maya Moore. I don't know if she thinks she's better than Maya Moore, but she saw Maya Moore and was delighted by it.
Yeah, that was an amazing moment. And that's about, this torch that has passed. I mean, you think about Maya Moore's age and why she left the game. Maya Moore should be playing right now. But I thought that was great to see, and great to see Caitlin acknowledge somebody who's been obviously a tremendous influence on her career. And again, this offers an entry path and an entryway for those who are just now discovering women's basketball because of Caitlin Clark. I don't begrudge you. I'm not going to do you how sometimes soccer fans will do new fans that come to their sport and just totally haze them the entire time. Welcome, and I'm glad you're here. But while you're here, make sure that you look through those archives to see some of the women who have done it before.
See you later, Jemele. Good talking to you.
All right.